excited to talk politics? Yes, yes. All right. This is going to be a great panel. I'm really looking forward to it, especially since it's a conversation I've been really wanting to have with people across the aisle. I am a progressive, and this panel is about conservatism. So that might sound weird, but I think it's important to have a conversation like this with people that we may disagree with, so we can actually come up with better solutions to run the country properly. So, without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce our panelists. We have Grover Norquist. He is the president and founder of Americans for Tax Reform. And our second panelist today is Congressman Mark Sanford. He is the Republican member of the House of Representatives from South Carolina. Hello, gentlemen.
Hello.
All right, so I want to start the conversation off because this whole panel is about the future of conservatism, you know, during and after the Trump administration. I kind of want to talk about your thoughts on Trump because you guys differ slightly. And I think it's important to kind of differentiate, you know, your thoughts and how you think the Republican Party should move forward. Let me start with you, Grover.
Sure. I think step one is to recognize that the federal government is interesting. There's a House and a Senate as well as a president, but there are 50 states, 7,000 plus state legislators, and what moves the country politically is what's going on in 50 states, 10,000, 12,000 taxing jurisdictions, as well as Washington, D.C. So the president has a signature, and he can appoint judges. That's powerful. He has a veto. But I would step back and look at where things are going. I'm very happy with the movement across the states on criminal justice reform. We don't need as many people in prison for as long as that are there. Prohibition has not worked very well. And so we're making real progress state by state on a number of these issues. States are giving up. A couple years ago, police took more money from people in civil asset forfeiture and didn't give it back than all the robbers in the country together, okay? We're talking about billions of dollars. State by state, we're ending that process. You know, if somebody's convicted and the money they had was from the bank robbery, you can keep it. But under present law, they keep it whether there's a charge, never mind a conviction. So progress like that at the state level is making its way up to the federal level, and I think along the way, there are a whole series of victories for people who would like to lead more open, free, less annoyed lives.
I can't wait to get into a deep dive on policy issues, and I commend you for wanting criminal justice reform. But just to be clear, under the Trump administration, with Jeff Sessions as the head of the Justice Department, he's actually loosened restrictions on civil asset forfeiture. So as far as the Trump administration goes, we haven't seen any changes, any positive changes when it comes to that issue.
Well, at the federal level, the issue of getting prison reform is actually led by the first son-in-law, right? President's daughter's husband, Jared. He's been pushing very hard on this. I've gone and met with members, Republicans and Democrats on the Hill, moving forward the idea that going to prison should be the punishment. Getting beat up in prison should not be the punishment. That we have to run the prisons better, and we don't need to have as many people in prison for as long as we do in order to keep crime lower, you know.
So overall, you are supportive of the president and far less critical than...
Well, on a number of issues, yes. Not on the approach he's taken on trade, I think, is dangerous.
Right.
On criminal justice reform, everybody except the AG's fine.
All right. So
that's our challenge.
So we're going to come back to policy in just a minute. But Congressman Sanford, you differ slightly when it comes to the president. You have been one of the members of Congress, Republican members of Congress, who has openly criticized the president and spoken out against him. And And while you and I do disagree when it comes to policy issues, I do commend you for taking a principled stance on several issues pertaining to President Trump. So can you talk to me a little bit about what those criticisms are?
My larger criticism is this. I mean, the beauty of the American political experiment is that we can agree to disagree. That you might have a very liberal perspective, I might have a conservative perspective, but we could sit down at the table and we could begin to hash out ideas and say, well, you know, I'm coming at it from this way and you're coming at it from that way, and we could begin to forge a conclusion that might have a little bit of something in there for both of us. And the danger, I believe, of Donald Trump is that he's autocratic in style. And what I found in my objections to him was that you could agree on the preponderance of issues, which I happen to, because I'm a conservative. But because you publicly criticized, he went after me in my primary. I lost my primary. He was a contributor to that. And the larger landscape that we're living in is the dangerous part of what I see with Donald Trump, which is, again, a style that is not conducive to the open debate of ideas, again, which has been the hallmark of the American experiment.
So that's a great answer. And, you know, you really did pay the price politically for speaking out, which I thought was fascinating. So you lost the primary to Katie Arrington, who is a huge Trump supporter. That was essentially the focal point of her campaign. She attacked you for attacking Trump. And it worked. And by the way, Trump wanted to take credit for your loss by saying that he tweeted against you 3 hours before the polls were closed, which it's kind of...
No, but it was the larger, again, confines of the debate, which was at in her victory celebration, her words were, "We are the party of Donald Trump." And I said, you know, I could not more conclusively disagree. The Republican Party has been built upon the ideas, again, it might be different than any one of yours individually, but on the idea of market-based ideas, which I think Grover was going to get at with free trade and adherence to the Constitution and free market principles, go down the list. It is not a cult of personality. And the danger that we're playing with right now is in either party to have a cult of personality, because our founding fathers were so deliberate in forming a nation of laws and not men. And if we go against that in slightest form, we're playing with fire.
So, Grover, during the Republican primary, you endorsed Scott Walker, and you were not openly critical of Trump. In fact, during the 2016 election, while everybody was engaging in rhetoric on Twitter and social media that was, you know, pretty aggressive, you decided to focus on other things. So, for instance, there was, some would say, a fringe element of the right that was constantly attacking the fact that, you know, you would stand up for Muslims. Your wife is Muslim. And Trump really did hone in on that and exploit that to his advantage. He exploited identity politics to his advantage. And you didn't openly criticize him for that, but it was clear that you weren't supportive of the way that he was behaving. You are actually very liberal. I mean, I can't believe that you've been a Burning Man several times. You know, I haven't been a Burning Man, I'd love to go, but it's kind of interesting how different you are when it comes to certain social issues from what Donald Trump has campaigned for. But you didn't let those differences get in the way because there was one issue that you care about more than anything. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, he didn't ask to be a friend. His job is to veto bad bills and appoint people. I think it's a danger for Republicans or Democrats to focus too much on the presidency. The Republican Party used to focus completely on the presidency because they thought they could never carry the House or the Senate. If you go back to Eisenhower and Nixon, you had overwhelming Democrat majorities most of those years. Reagan, Bush, strong Democrat control of Congress most of the years. And Republicans thought we got to put all our energy behind the president because he has a veto to stop really bad stuff and can manage national defense, which the Democrats at that point were less interested in. And so it's very presidential focused, and the Democrats were quite congressionally focused. And I always thought that was an error. I still think it's an error. I think it's nice to have the presidency. It's nice to have the House and Senate. But if you made me pick, I'd rather have the House and Senate than the presidency. So I have focused not just on Trump, but Bush going back. I'm much more interested in governors, state legislators, because they changed things in 50 states. And if you want to change Washington, D.C., the only way we're ever going to deal with an issue like marijuana prohibition is to go state by state, which is exactly what's working. What didn't work with these votes every once in a while in Washington, D.C. that went nowhere and actually got you pushback. Right to try, which legalizes drugs for people who are terminally ill, but the FDA hasn't yet decided that the drug's effective. And they say, if you give us another 5 years, we can probably decide it's effective. Well, another 5 years, I'm dead. How about if you let me take that risk about pharmaceuticals? We got 41 states to legalize drugs the FDA, Federal Drug Administration, said were illegal in all 50 states at the national level. 40 states said, you may say it's illegal, to hell with you. If somebody's dying of a disease and this drug may help them, and you've said it's safe, okay, it's not going to kill you faster than what you got, it's safe. And then we had almost unanimous votes in the House and the Senate to pass a law that had passed in 40 states. We could never, ever, ever have gotten that with a continuous set of votes in Washington, D.C. Only through the states. Only through the states.
I completely agree with you that, state level politics, local politics are incredibly important. However, I think that what we're seeing right now is a fundamental breakdown of our democratic system. And what I mean by that is the whole purpose of these congressional lawmakers is that they are supposed to serve as a check and a balance to executive power. But what we're seeing with Trump is this cult of personality. We are seeing a president who does execute policy unilaterally. He did that with trade. He signed multiple executive orders since he's come into office. So many executive orders that I expected Republican members of Congress to speak out, because they certainly did it when Obama signed executive orders, right? And what I'm noticing is, if you do have principled lawmakers and they do speak out, they pay a political consequence for that. And unfortunately, that's what I noticed with you, Congressman Sanford. And so what do we do about this fundamental breakdown of checks and balances? Because I believe that there are Republican lawmakers who find some of Trump's behaviors and policies objectionable, but they refuse to speak out. So how do you combat that?
One person at a time. I don't think that there's any, silver bullet, if you will, as to push back with regard to any presidency, Republican or Democrat. I think it goes in part to what Grover's getting at, which is the fabric of state legislative bodies and a judicial system. But what I would say is this, and this goes back to the importance of festivals like this, it's important that each one of you look for ways of emboldening whoever it is that is your representative in House or Senate or at a more local level. Politics don't work well if there's a vacuum. There needs to be more noise. There needs to be more pushback, again, at a local level. I'm not saying be obnoxious at a local restaurant to somebody who's an appointee, but what I am saying is look for ways of having those conversations either in the public square or privately with reps to make noise. It's the squeaking wheels that get grease in politics. End of story. And there's no simple formula beyond that.
Can I challenge the suggestion that there's been a reduction or breakdown in checks and balances?
Please do.
What the president did on using a national defense loophole, which Congress gave him, they said, if it's national defense, you can throw up a tariff for no good reason, except the president says it's national defense. And that's all you need. That's what he's doing, okay? That's why we've got tariffs against Canada over national defense issues, says evidently what they did to the White House back in 1812. But
he did misuse that executive power that Congress gave him.
Not legally. You couldn't go to court and take that away from him. Congress gave him those powers. During the Cold War, during World War II, frankly, during every war we've ever had, Congress has handed the president, it's not Republicans and Democrats, it's each, from the Civil War to the First World War to the Second World War to the Cold War, Congress was constantly giving the president, a lot of these laws they pass, these are the laws unless the president says national security, okay? And so all you have to do is yell national security and a whole bunch of these laws don't matter anymore. So that's one where Congress is going, courts can't do it for you because Congress wrote the law and said there's this escape clause. You don't have to come to us. The guy who's actually been making the most noise on this is Rand Paul, and nobody's paying attention to his questioning. You know, guys, we gave the president these powers. This is not a good idea. We keep going to wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, without having anybody declare the wars. At some point, if Congress had to vote, that might not happen, but that doesn't happen. So this has been going on for a long time. It is to notice it now with Trump is kind of to miss things. What Trump has done on the executive orders largely has been undoing executive orders from previous administrations, and which is why he's able to do it by himself, because the previous president did it by himself.
But I didn't see previous presidents pointing to our allies, like Canada, for instance, and claiming that we need to renegotiate trade out of nowhere and slap on tariffs because of national security issues. So the reason why Trump is getting as much attention as he's getting is, yes, he's Trump, and as it is, he is boisterous and, of course, attracts a lot of attention. But more importantly, he has made a point to antagonize our allies, our trade allies, and randomly, in a very unnuanced way, slap these tariffs on, you know, aluminum and steel. And so that's the reason why he's getting attention. And so while I think possibly a case can be made that you should give the president a loophole in national security situations, this clearly was not a national security situation. It was an abuse of power by the president.
Well, the target, what they'll argue is that the target was China with aluminum and steel, and that China sells through other countries. So there are countries that don't have any steel mills that sell us steel that comes from China. And so that's why they end up targeting all these other countries, including stuff that comes through Canada and so on. So that's where you get the other ones. My strong preference would be to have free trade laws, to have free trade. But if you're going to have tariffs, which are taxes, tariffs are simply taxes. Tariffs are nothing other than taxes. They're not something special or different. They're just particularly stupid and destructive taxes placed on the American consumer. When we put up tariffs, we hurt Americans. When the French put up tariffs, they hurt French people, which may be a good idea or not. But it's them doing it to themselves, okay? It's not them doing it to us. So a lot of people don't understand free trade. The president evidently doesn't see it that way.
Free trade.
And it's a challenge. There are two questions. One is presidential power. The other is the question of, is free trade the best approach? And what made the United States successful, I think one of the big successes, is we're a very large free trade zone. People in, you know, New Mexico can sell stuff to people in Rhode Island, and you can move, and you can, Europeans have a hard time moving from one country to another. And I mean, you open a car door and you're in another country in Europe. You know, they act, you know, there's this big problem with mobility. Yeah. We don't have that here. And that's one of the successes we have. Both people are mobile and capital and goods.
So okay, let's talk a little bit more about Trump's fiscal policy, because I think it's fascinating. You know, what's happening with our deficit, for instance. There was some news recently. The Trump administration actually released this news quietly on a Friday night, but it turns out that the deficit projections are much higher than previously expected. So about $1.08 trillion deficit, which is partly contributed contributed through the tax cuts that Trump pushed for and Congress successfully passed. So I want to open this question up to you first, Congressman Sanford, because you are famous for being a deficit hawk. In fact, you were incredibly principled back in 2009 when you rejected federal stimulus money from the federal government under the Obama administration. So what are your feelings about what's happening right now with Trump's fiscal policy?
I'd say this, and I think that everybody who has kids or grandkids needs to warn them. I think we're walking our way into the most predictable financial crisis in the history of man. I think it will be bigger than the Great Depression. I think it's going to have incredible implications on every one of us, the value of the dollar, future inflation, our way of life. It's a big deal. My problem with the president on this front is that ultimately he's an economic populist. He's not a conservative. Again, we might come from different pages of the book in terms of philosophy on how you get there, but at the end of the day, he's neither where you might be nor where I might be, because fundamentally it's nothing more than populism. And what's populism? Telling you what you want to hear. So if you look at the presidential campaign, he went to Iowa, he told the corn farmers, we're not going to do anything with your ethanol. And he talks to the seniors, says, we're not going to touch Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. So I got into with Mick Mulvaney, who's the OMB director, who was a former colleague, a couple months ago in the budget hearing, because I said, fundamentally what you're doing is you're selling a lie. And the lie is that we can balance the budget without impacting Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. It's about 80% the pie. At the end of the day, we're all going to have to get in the boat together. But the message that's being sold by the administration right now, and my difficulty with it, is that it's selling something that can't come true. And as a consequence, it puts us into that much bigger a hole as we wait and wait and wait to deal with this financial storm coming our way.
So can you elaborate a little more on how you see this playing out economically? Because you are not the only conservative who's made this point. There is a businessman by the name of Peter Schiff. We disagree on a number of things, but recently he was speaking to Joe Rogan's podcast, and specifically mentioned how disastrously this is all going to blow up. And I want everyone to kind of understand the reasons why. Why do you think it's going to be negative for the economy in the long run?
Put it this way, if you believe in the law of averages, which we all do, they sooner or later work out. The economic recovery that we're now in is 96 months. We're 96 months into it. We're in the second longest economic recovery in American history. The average economic recovery in American history since World War II has been about half that time, about 54 months. I don't know when it ends exactly. I'm not an economic forecaster, but I do know that the law of averages work. And so at some point, if you're the second longest economic recovery in history, things are going to slow down. Now you begin to add compounding effects. The compounding effects are the Fed has, in essence, arbitrarily held the interest rate down low, artificially, so that we don't really see the cost of debt. But if we were to go simply back up, if you look at the blended rate, I don't want to get overly technical, we're about 2.5%. The historic average is about double that. If you go simply back to the average, all of a sudden our numbers zoom. If you look at the economic budget forecast that were laid out just a couple of weeks ago in Washington, what they said was without 1% increase in interest rate, just in the status quo, we're going to go from spending, we'll in essence quadruple our debt payments. We're quickly moving. This is in a 10-year window to numbers that are absolutely unsustainable. And if you believe that financial markets anticipate, which they do, sometime between now and 10 months, or sometime sooner if we go into an economic dip, we got trouble coming our way that'll have real implications in the debt and the deficit.
So, Grover, what is your response to that? Because the number one issue for you has always been tax cuts. You have been successful in getting the majority of Republican lawmakers to sign your pledge to refuse to raise taxes. Many have attempted or have been successful in cutting taxes. And so Larry Kudlow, who is Trump's economic advisor, was clear. He was on CNBC and he said that the deficit is huge, it's gigantic, and that we're running about 4 or 5% of the GDP based on these recent numbers. So there seems to be agreement on both the right and the left about how these tax cuts will be negative for the future of the American economy. What do you think about that? What is your response to that?
Two things. My focus is not tax cuts. My focus is liberty. And on the whole list of things, you have to ask yourself, can people run their lives and lead their lives as they wish to and be left alone? And make a list of the things you'd like to be left alone in. How much money the government takes from you is on the list. But the government figures a whole bunch of ways to poke at people beyond picking your pocket. So all of those issues of leaving people alone, letting them make their own decisions are key. On taxes, when you look at two things. Federal government spends too much money. State governments spend too much money. The deadweight cost of government is not the deficit. It's total spending. And it doesn't really matter to the economy whether the government takes all of that money, or whether it takes 90% of that money and borrows 10%. It's gone. It's been spent, either because you took it or you borrowed some of it and you spent it. If you took it all, you didn't solve a problem.
So what would you cut? What would you cut? Because I think that's where the important, solutions really lie. And I'm really curious to see what you think, because I agree there is a lot of government spending in the form of contracts for private, military contractors, in the form of subsidies for oil companies. I mean, where are oil companies going to go? I don't understand why they would need subsidies, but that's another example. And there seems to be a lot of emphasis on cutting social programs that Americans have paid into. I look at my check every 2 weeks, and I pay a lot of money into Social Security and Medicare. And when you have lawmakers specifically targeting those issues, I think that message is something very negative to the American people.
A couple things. One, the president has said, look, we're not going to deal with Social Security, which requires 60 votes by law, not just because of the Senate rules, but they put in a law when they reformed Social Security back in '83. They require 60 votes. So that's not changing. And Medicare is the same thing. Neither of those are going to be cut. What they're looking at is the other various structures, entitlement spending, which is guaranteed spending each year. But you don't cut that. You reform it. This is what Bill Clinton did back in '96. He didn't cut welfare. He block granted it out to the states. He said, this is how much you get, and it's going to grow with inflation, but not more than inflation. And there's some requirements that if you're able-bodied and between 25 and 55, we want you working or looking for work. And that dropped welfare spending and the number of people on welfare rather dramatically on the one program. Now, then,
so let me,
TANF, now it's TANF. I forget the other previous word for welfare. But that reforms government over time, so it costs less.
So
we need to do the same thing with pensions, which are bankrupting cities and states, not cutting pensions that we promise people now, but new people coming in need to have defined contribution pensions rather than defined benefit pensions that they have complete control over, rather than like in Detroit, where the government promises you the world, and then by the time the mayor's dead and you're supposed to get your retirement, they go, oops, we forgot. That we need to move away from towards what some states have begun to do, towards defined contribution pensions, like a 401k or an IRA that you own, that you control, not some bureaucrat in Detroit or in Washington.
So, okay, I hear you on that. But one of the issues with welfare reform, if there is evidence of people literally just sitting at home on their couch, not working, and just collecting a government check, I agree with you that we need to encourage them to work. But there are a lot of Americans right now who are working full-time jobs, and with the minimum wage, that they're receiving, they do not have enough money to provide for their families. Right? So what do you do about that? Because, look, one of the arguments in favor of the Trump-era tax cuts was, no, this is great. I mean, all of these corporations, they're going to create jobs, they're going to increase wages. And in the very beginning when this policy passed, there were some companies that gave a one-time bonus. They got a lot of positive coverage for that. But they did not increase their wages. In fact, what they did was they took those tax cuts and they did stock buybacks, and the executives essentially made themselves even richer. And so I do not want to subsidize these corporations in the form of government programs. I want these workers to get paid what they deserve to get paid. So what's your response to that?
Anybody who missed Economics 101, we're going to do a very quick thing on what a buyback is. When Apple brought several tens of billions of dollars that was locked overseas, I mean, one of the things when you look at what Trump was able to sign, the Republican House and Senate passed it, but this was the tax reform that every economist and Democrat senators would tell you, oh, yes, we want to do this, we want to do this, we want to do. Obama said he was going to do it when he got elected, and told all the guys at Silicon Valley, we're going to end this process where the United States is about the only country in the world, other than Eritrea, that says we tax money an American company earns here, and if you earn money in France, you pay French taxes, and if you ever bring that money back to the United States, you pay American taxes on top of that. What happens? $2 to $3 trillion was locked overseas, because if you brought it back, you got hit with this extra tax. So you left some of it overseas in cash, you left some of it overseas and built factories, because of our policy, not some dirty trick the Chinese government did to us, what we did to us, and what Europeans were smart enough not to do to themselves. And so we ended that process so you can take that money that's earned overseas, selling stuff to people in France and Germany, bring it back to France, Germany taxes it, you bring it back to the United States, you can invest it. Well, what if you buy back some of your stock? If you're Apple, right?
And
they
make yourself
pay
richer.
cash. Well, they pay it $1 cash for $1 worth of stock. I'm not sure how you get richer on that, unless you believe that your
artificially
stock
inflates the price of the shares. That's what happens.
It does, okay.
Yeah.
If you are paying more for them than they were worth, then you're not getting richer at it, okay? You're paying a market rate. Now, I want to invest in a company that says to itself, we have $1 billion. The best way we can invest $1 billion if you're Apple is in us, because we can spend that billion and make more money than investing in any other company. That's a healthy sign. It's not an unhealthy sign. When Apple takes $1 billion and gives it to people who own their stock, that money doesn't disappear.
Yeah,
They then reinvest it. It is a healthy
But they
thing,
reinvest
not a
it in their stocks. And the reason why they get richer is because the executives own shares of the company. So that's the reason why it happens. But I wish we could have a longer discussion on this.
You're buying stock at market prices. You're not getting...
Yeah, and you're artificially inflating it. So that's exactly what happens. The price of that stock goes up. But look, we gotta go. I have the red light, and I'm so sorry to interrupt you in the middle of this. But I just wanted to thank you guys for having this discussion with me.
Good to be with you.
Thank you for being such an incredible audience and being so respectful. Grover Norquist, Congressman Mark Sanford, thank you again. And please be open and willing to talk to one another. Do reach across the aisle. Do have these debates, but do so in a civil way. Thank you.
Vote and come to Burning Man this year.